The spring morning spread its soft rays over the city, and the breeze carried the sweet scent of freshly bloomed flowers. Claire sat on an old wooden bench worn by time, with a book with a yellowed cover in her hands. Her eyes moved over the words, but her mind seemed to drift beyond the pages, immersed in silent thoughts. The laughter of children and the distant song of birds created a familiar melody, but the unexpected sound of footsteps and paws caught her attention. James, with a carefree smile and his golden-haired dog, stopped a few meters away from her. The meeting was as casual as the dance of leaves in the wind. James noticed Claire's involuntary smile as she looked up, and a spark of curiosity lit up in his chest. "Is that a good book?" he asked, nodding at the cover in her hands. Claire raised an eyebrow, surprised by the approach, but felt a warm comfort in his voice. "It's more than good," she replied, closing the book almost reverently. Thus, the conversation began, as natural as the whisper of the wind, and the hours passed without them noticing. James was a newly graduated architect, with dreams as grand as the projects he drew in his notebooks. Claire, on the other hand, was a literature student, passionate about words and stories that defied time. They discovered shared interests in music, poets, and dreams of exploring the world. The connection between them was something that couldn't be explained, only felt. The sun rose high, and the world around them seemed to fall silent, as if it were watching that first meeting with the same curious attention that life seemed to have. In that park, unspoken promises of future meetings were drawn in the air. James laughed at Claire's enthusiastic description of an author he barely knew, and she blushed when he mentioned that he thought the sound of her laughter was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Time, relentless as always, began to demand their return to reality. With one last look and a smile full of possibilities, James walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the stone path, followed by the friendly bark of his dog. In the following weeks, that bench in the park became the meeting point for two hearts that, without realizing it, had already begun to beat in the same rhythm. It was there that James would tell stories about the houses he dreamed of building, and Claire would talk about the trips she hoped to take. Each meeting brought a new discovery, a new detail that made them feel closer. The lingering glances and knowing smiles became more frequent, and the future seemed like something they could shape together. But fate, with its sharp irony, had already begun to draw invisible lines for a chapter neither of them could foresee. On that sunny spring day, as they talked under the oak tree shading the bench, a letter arrived for James. It was a job offer in a distant city, an opportunity he knew he couldn't refuse. The smile that had been constant was now filled with uncertainty. Claire noticed the hesitation in his eyes, and an unspoken question lingered between them. Before leaving, James promised to stay in touch. At their last meeting in the park, with the sunlight gilding his hair and his heart heavy with farewell, he gave Claire a hug that said everything he couldn't put into words. The spring that had begun as a new beginning now bid farewell with the promise of a long wait. And so a new chapter began, full of hopes and uncertainties, with the park now empty but filled with memories that would echo for a long time. The park, once so full of laughter and shared glances, now seemed like a silent place to Claire. The absence of James left a void that afternoons filled with books couldn't soothe. The memories of their meetings under the oak echoed in her mind like a distant whisper. But a promise had been made, and Claire held on to it with all her strength. Each day brought the anticipation of a new letter, a connection to the love that had begun to blossom, even at a distance. James, for his part, didn't let the distance dim the brightness of his feelings. Barely settled in the new city, he already felt the longing consuming him. He would sit at his desk every night, the smell of ink filling the air, and put down on paper every thought he couldn't express in spoken words. He wrote about the unfamiliar city, the challenges of his new job, and most importantly, how much he missed talking with Claire and seeing her smile. The first letter arrived in a simple envelope, with handwriting that Claire would recognize anywhere. Her hands trembled as she opened it, as if holding something too precious to rush through. Reading it was both a relief and a pain. James described the new environment in detail, but every line was filled with longing. She felt a warm comfort spread through her chest and quickly replied, filling the page with thoughts that carried her essence. Thus, a romance of letters began to take shape. The days were intertwined with the anticipation of a new envelope, and each letter brought with it the hope of a future reunion. Their words danced between them, full of promises, laughter, and shared dreams. James revealed his plans, spoke of new friendships, and how the city lit up at night, but no description was complete without mentioning how much he missed her. Claire, in turn, wrote about her studies, the books she read, and how the oak in the park still seemed to hold their secrets. But life, with its unpredictable humor, brought the unexpected. One night, after weeks of exchanged letters, James sat at the table with a glint in his eyes. He wrote a different letter, one that carried the weight of his heart. He declared his love for Claire, spoke of plans to return, and how he envisioned a future together. The envelope was sealed carefully, a stamp marking the promise of tomorrow, but fate had other plans for that letter. Days passed, and Claire waited anxiously for a response that never came. Each visit to the mailbox turned hope into anxiety. The weeks stretched out like an endless desert, and the lack of a response was a painful blow. Claire began to think that perhaps the distance had extinguished what they felt, and the days in the park became just a distant memory. James also waited for a reply that never came. The hours turned into days and the days into weeks. Doubt began to eat away at the certainty in his heart. Had Claire changed her mind? The silence grew more deafening with each passing day, and slowly, a bitter sense of loss began to seep into his life. The romance they built with words now seemed like a fragile illusion, ready to disappear. The letter that held James's heart, with every word pulsing with emotion and hope, never found its way to its destination. A small address mix-up led it to be delivered to a house on the next street, a house that, ironically, had been empty for months. The envelope remained there, forgotten in a pile of lost mail, while the days of waiting stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. James, sitting in his small room in the new city, began to resign himself to the silence. Each day, the hope that fueled his desire for a response from Claire dwindled a little more. He looked at the last letter he received from her, now creased from being handled so much, and tried to find a reason for the void that settled between them. Perhaps she had found someone else. Perhaps the distance was simply too strong. Doubt gnawed at his mind, replacing the certainty of love with a shadow of uncertainty. Claire, meanwhile, spent her mornings in the park, now with a distant expression. The oak tree that had witnessed their shared laughter now seemed a silent guardian of painful memories. She wondered why the letters had stopped coming, why the connection that had blossomed so vividly between them had suddenly vanished. The weight of absence began to turn longing into something colder, a sense of loss she couldn't explain. Summer turned into autumn, and the leaves fell like small echoes of what Claire and James had lost. Determined to move on, Claire immersed herself in her studies, trying to fill the void with her passion for words and stories. Yet in every line she read, in every poem she recited, there was a whisper of something unresolved, a part of herself that longed for answers that never came. Pressed by work and the relentless pace of life in the big city, James began to distance himself even further from the dream he once shared with Claire. The letters he had once written fervently became abandoned drafts, and time, that eternal rival, hid the memories under layers of new routines and responsibilities. He convinced himself that perhaps the spring love was just that, a fleeting love, born under the sun and lost in the shadows. However, destiny never completely forgets the hearts it binds. Years later, that letter, with its old stamp and words that had never been read, would be found under circumstances that would change everything. But at that moment, silence continued to spread between them like an impassable river, separating two souls who didn't know what truly kept them apart. Winter came, and the park was covered in a serene white. Claire, now older and with invisible scars, looked at the oak tree without expecting to see James returning. The love that once warmed her now seemed part of a story she told herself on the loneliest nights. Meanwhile, in a distant city, James ended his days with weariness in his eyes, unaware that the words that could have changed his fate were just a few miles away, still waiting to be discovered. Time passed like a river that never stops flowing, carrying away the memories and hopes that James and Claire once shared. Claire, unaware of the letters that never reached her, faced the years with the pain of a farewell she never understood. She convinced herself that James had moved on, and although she tried to forget, the memories persisted, whispering on rainy nights and in the pages of books filled with stories of lost loves. Claire's life took an unexpected turn. After graduating, she took a job as a literature teacher at a local school. The classroom became her refuge, and the stories she taught a way to keep her emotions safe. She had relationships, some fleeting and others more lasting, but none of them ignited the same fire she had felt with James. In her quietest moments, she would glance at the oak tree through the window and wonder if destiny was just a cruel storyteller. James, on the other hand, did his best to leave the past behind. In his new city, he built a respectable career as an architect, known for projects that blended beauty and functionality. Each line he drew was precise, as if seeking perfection in his work could compensate for the chaos in his heart. He married, had children, but never spoke of the young woman with the radiant smile who had once brightened his mornings. The years softened the pain, but the scar never fully disappeared. Over time, the emotional distance between them grew as vast as the physical one. Claire still passed by the park occasionally, but she no longer lingered as before. The oak tree aged, its leaves falling and growing back in continuous cycles, witnessing the passage of time and the unfolding lives that had once crossed its branches. Sometimes, Claire would sit for a moment, close her eyes, and let the wind play with her hair, but soon she would get up, walking away with a weight only she understood. James, caught up in ambitious projects and work trips, barely had time to think about the past. Yet there were moments when something as simple as a melody, or the scent of a freshly opened book would make him pause. Claire's face would appear in his mind, vivid and luminous, as if time had no power over that specific memory. He never knew the reason for the silence that separated their lives, and over the years, he learned to live with that doubt, though on sleepless nights, he still wondered what would have happened if she had responded to his letter. Life went on as it always does, with new beginnings and endings. Claire found love again, married, and became a mother, but kept in a forgotten corner of herself the sense that something was incomplete. James, too, embraced his family and achievements, but the echo of an interrupted love lingered in his gaze. Both went on with their lives, shaped by the choices they made and the answers they never found. The silence between them seemed final, but fate, with its peculiar humor, never forgets the stories it starts telling. As they lived their routines, a pile of forgotten letters in a dark attic waited for the right moment to be discovered. It was as if the past held one last breath, one last attempt to intertwine the paths of two hearts that, unknowingly, still beat in sync. Decades passed, and the lives of Claire and James intertwined with other stories, other people, other promises. Claire dedicated herself heart and soul to her profession, becoming a respected teacher admired for her contagious passion for literature. Her name was known among her students as someone who could bring words to life, but behind closed doors, she was just a woman who, on lonely nights, still thought about a letter that never came. James built a solid career signing projects that were featured in architecture magazines. He was a respected man, with a firm smile and the confident gaze of someone who knew the weight of time well. His marriage was stable. His children had grown up and followed their own paths. Yet when the silence of the house enveloped him at night, there was an emptiness that neither success nor personal achievements could fill. The memories of the days spent in the park became fragments that appeared unexpectedly. For Claire, the old oak tree that still shaded the worn bench became a symbol of something that had never been fully hers. For James, it was an image that appeared in dreams, a memory of youth that mingled with the sounds and scents of the city where he now lived. Both learned to live with the echo of the past, but neither knew how to completely erase the pain of the silence. Life continued to offer new opportunities. Claire taught generations of students, watched the world change over the years, and saw her children grow. The love she found after James was good and safe, but never as overwhelming as what she had felt for that young architect she had met under the spring sun. The memories, although dusted by time, were still part of who she was. James, on the other hand, dedicated himself to new projects and trips that took him to places he never thought he would visit. He learned to appreciate what he had, but in moments of distraction, his thoughts would drift back to Claire and what could have been. There was a feeling of incomplete resolution, a curiosity that was never satisfied. The letter he had written, carrying the weight of his most sincere emotions, remained an absence he couldn't explain. Despite everything, the years shaped them differently. Claire became more serene, with eyes that reflected wisdom and a slight melancholy. James, on the other hand, kept the energy that work demanded, but his gaze carried a depth few could understand. Both had moved on, but in directions that, unbeknownst to them, were still connected by invisible threads, drawn by fate with a precision only it understood. And so life continued, without them noticing the twists fate was preparing. An unexpected discovery awaited on the horizon, a secret hidden in a dark corner of a house that Claire barely knew held memories of the past. The pile of letters, forgotten and untouched, was about to reveal the truth, like the final piece of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Time, which had always been their enemy, was beginning to weave the threads of a new chance. The attic of Claire's house was a place she rarely visited. Among dusty boxes and old furniture, memories of a life that seemed distant rested there. One spring morning, determined to organize the belongings accumulated over the years, she climbed the narrow stairs with a feeling of nostalgia. The smell of aged wood and old papers enveloped her, bringing forth a sensation she couldn't name. As she sifted through a box of photo albums and old letters, something caught her eye. A bundle tied with faded twine was hidden at the bottom of a larger box, among newspaper clippings and mementos of past times. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine as she saw the handwriting on the first letter in the bundle. Her heart began to beat faster, a heavy foreboding flooding her. With trembling hands, she untied the string and began to read. They were letters from James. One after another, words that had never reached her unfolded, telling stories, longing, and finally, the declaration of love he had made that first spring when they parted. Claire read each one with tears streaming down her face, feeling the presence of a lost time, a connection that should never have been broken. The letter in which he confessed his feelings and spoke of plans for a future together was still there, intact, the ink slightly faded but the strength of his emotions preserved. She remembered the nights she waited for a response, the days she wondered why he had stopped writing. The answers were now in her hands, weighing as if they carried all the years of silence and unanswered questions. Claire sat on the wooden floor of the attic, surrounded by the letters, her heart conflicted between joy and pain. Fate had been cruel in its game, hiding those words for so long. As she read, she realized details she never knew about James's life after he left. The letters spoke of loneliness, the struggle to hold on to hope, and how he wondered why she never replied. A doubt that now echoed in her own thoughts. How had those letters ended up in her attic? Claire vaguely remembered an elderly aunt who had lived there for a while before moving to a care home. Perhaps, somehow, the letters had been mistakenly delivered and kept away by accident. The discovery of the letters brought a new unease. What to do with those words now, after so much time? Claire knew she needed to see James, to explain what had happened, to understand what might still be between them. Time, which had once been her enemy, now offered an unexpected opportunity. It was as if those letters had waited for the right moment to be found, a last act of hope preserved by fate. Determined, Claire began to plan. She found out that James, now a renowned architect, would be attending an event in a nearby city. The thought of seeing him again, after so many years, brought a mix of excitement and nervousness. With the letters in her hands, she knew it was time to face the past, and perhaps rewrite the ending of a story that felt unfinished. Fate, with all its twists, was offering them a new chance. The train left the station with a gentle jolt, and Claire, sitting by the window, watched the lush landscape pass by quickly. Each mile traveled seemed to take her further from the weight of doubt and closer to the answer she had been seeking for so long. James's letters were tucked safely in her bag, close to her chest like an amulet. Her heart beat rapidly, reflecting the mix of anxiety and hope that filled her. During the journey, Claire's mind wandered between the past and the present. She remembered the afternoons in the park, the laughter they shared, and the sparkle in James's eyes when he talked about his dreams. Now, decades later, she wondered how he would react when he saw her. Had time softened the memories for him as it had for her? Or was it possible that beneath the surface of the lives they had built, there was still something intact, waiting to be rediscovered? The train finally arrived at the city, and Claire stepped off with hesitant steps. The station was bustling, full of voices and smiles, but she felt as if she were in a bubble, isolated by the intensity of her emotions. With a map in hand, she walked through the streets to the venue where James would be, an impressive auditorium that hosted the architecture event. As she approached, the sound of voices and applause made her pause for a moment, taking a deep breath before entering. The hall was grand, illuminated by soft lights that highlighted models and drawings displayed in glass cases. Claire felt a pang of pride when she saw James's name on one of the award-winning projects. He was there in the center of the crowd, gesturing as he talked with colleagues and admirers. His hair, now gray, and his confident posture showed the man time had shaped, but the features she loved were still there, unmistakable. She moved forward slowly, her heart pounding, until finally, he looked in her direction. James's eyes, which had been fixed on a distant point, met hers and, for a second time, seemed to stop. His expression changed from surprise to a recognition that held a mix of emotion and disbelief. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, until a hesitant smile curved James's lips. Claire took a step forward, her fingers trembling as she reached for the bag where the letters were. James, still stunned, walked toward her, questions forming on his face. When they finally stood face to face, the world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the echoes of a story that had begged to be resolved. With a voice choked with emotion, she said, "These are your letters, James. I never received them." The surprise in his eyes gave way to a slow, deep understanding. James took the bundle carefully, feeling the weight of those unread words, and looked at Claire with a mixture of pain and relief. All these years, he murmured almost to himself. The connection they felt, even after so much time, was still there, beating strongly. And in that moment they realized that fate, despite its cruelty, might be giving them a chance to pick up where they left off. James held the bundle of letters with trembling fingers, as if each envelope were made of glass ready to shatter. The crowd around them, once a mass of indistinct voices, disappeared, leaving only him and Claire, immersed in a moment that seemed to transcend time. Her words echoed in his mind. I never received them. The weight of the past, the questions, and the silent pain finally found an answer. He looked at Claire, his eyes reflecting surprise, longing, and a touch of regret. With a slight nod, James indicated a room to the side, a more private space. They walked in silence, side by side, until they found themselves in a small office overlooking the sunny courtyard of the auditorium. James placed the letters on the table, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was dense, filled with years of unspoken words and guarded emotions. Claire, watching his hands, saw that they trembled slightly, the same tremor she felt in her own body. I don't understand. James finally broke the silence, his voice rough and low. Why didn't they reach you? Claire sighed, her eyes brimming with tears, and recounted the recent discovery, the attic, and the letters that had somehow been kept by the aunt who once lived there. I never knew, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. I waited for answers, but when they didn't come, I thought you had given up on us. James ran a hand over his face, as if trying to contain the flood of emotions overwhelming him. Slowly, he picked up the first letter from the bundle and opened it, his eyes following each line with an almost reverent attention. Claire watched, each second feeling like an eternity. She knew what those letters contained. Promises of a love that never faded, words that could have changed the course of their lives. When he finished reading, James looked up, his eyes now shining with a mix of pain and tenderness. I wrote these with everything I had, he confessed. I thought the silence was your answer. Claire stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. Fate was cruel, James, but we're here now, and the words we lost are still alive. James's expression softened, a sad smile curving his lips. It was a smile that said everything: regret, longing, but also the hope that was beginning to rekindle. He touched her hand, feeling for the first time in decades the reconnection he had always wished for. The afternoon wore on, but for them time seemed suspended. James and Claire spent hours reminiscing, sharing stories of what they had lived through in all the years apart. There was sadness in the tales of loves and losses, but there was also an indescribable relief in finally sharing the truths they had kept for so long. The light in James's eyes and Claire's soft laughter began to fill the space between them, as if the past had only waited for this moment to heal. What now? Claire asked, the question hanging between them with the same uncertainty they felt. James held the letters, now not a symbol of loss, but of something that had finally found its way. Now we write our own letter to the future, he replied, his voice firm and resolute. They smiled, and in that moment they knew there was still time, still love. Fate, which once separated them, seemed ready to give them a second chance. That night, the city seemed to breathe with an unusual calm. Claire and James walked side by side through the streets, feeling the light breeze that carried the scent of flowers and the whisper of leaves in the trees. The silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a bridge connecting the past to the present. Their reunion had awakened in both of them a sense of renewal, a hope that refused to be ignored. The years of distance and silence now seemed like only a prelude to what was yet to come. When they reached a small cafe on a quiet corner, they sat at a table by the window, where they could watch the street illuminated by the yellow lights of the lampposts. James pulled a pen from his pocket and placed it on the table next to a notepad the waiter had left. Claire looked at him, surprised. "You still carry a pen?" she asked with a smile. James shrugged, his eyes gleaming in a way she hadn't seen since the days in the park. Some habits never change. He took the notepad and wrote the first words, his handwriting still strong and unmistakable. "Dear Claire." The simple sight of those words made her heart race. Claire laughed, a laugh that mixed surprise and emotion. "Are we writing a letter?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. James nodded, passing the pen to her. "This time there will be no fate to fail us. We'll write it together. And this will be the beginning of a new story." Claire held the pen for a moment, her fingers hesitating. The words, so often held back over the years, now seemed to flow with ease. She wrote about how she felt when she found the letters, the mix of shock and longing, and the impulse that drove her to travel there. James read silently, his eyes following each word with reverence. Then he took the pen and continued, describing the years he thought she had forgotten him, the days he almost wrote again but held back out of fear of the silence. The letter grew between them, line by line, filled with confessions and dreams. It was not just a declaration of love, but a record of the path they had both traveled, apart and together. Claire talked about her years of teaching, how each class she taught was a way of telling stories that helped her cope with her own. James, in turn, spoke of the projects he completed, the travels, and the nights when, without explanation, a memory of her would flash like a warm light amidst his routine. When the last line was written, the cafe around them was beginning to empty, and the clock marked the end of the night. James placed the letter in an envelope and looked at Claire, with a smile that mixed relief and anticipation. "This time, our letter will not be lost," he said. Claire smiled, feeling the tears forming in her eyes but not letting them fall. "It won't," she confirmed, squeezing his hand, feeling the certainty that only the reunion of souls can provide. They left the cafe together, the envelope safely in James's hands. The city, which held so many stories, now witnessed a new one, a story of rebirth and second chances. Under the soft light of the moon and the sparkle of the stars, Claire and James walked toward a future they could finally write. And with every step, they felt that fate, despite its whims and silences, had given them one last, precious chance to live the love that had never faded. Reflecting on Claire and James's journey, we see how time can be both cruel and generous. They spent decades separated by a misunderstanding, by a lost letter. But in the end, fate showed that it is never too late to rewrite one's story. This is a lesson about second chances, about never underestimating the power of true love that can cross distances and overcome silence. Claire and James remind us that even when everything seems lost, the unexpected can bring back what our hearts have always sought. If this story touched you and you believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to receive more heartwarming stories like this. Share this video with friends and family to spread this message of hope and love that withstands the test of time. Join us for more stories that warm the heart and inspire belief that fate can always surprise us.